Hello everyone, I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm Jenny Mutley-Collins and I'll be moderating today's session along with my two colleagues Stuart Vinney and Jenny Turnbull. During the webinar, you'll be able to hear our speaker for today, Deb Hobbs, and to see her slides, but you won't be able to see Deb herself. You won't need a microphone. If you want to ask a question, please use the chat box. That's the one that's marked chat, not the question and answer box, at the end of Deb's presentation during the scheduled question and answer session. The recording of this webinar will be on our blog and on YouTube next week. Your attendance certificate will be available at the end of the presentation, and we'll also email you a copy of the certificate the week after the webinar. So, I'm very pleased to welcome Deb as this afternoon's presenter. Deborah Hobbs works in Bristol as a freelance author and instructional designer, and also as an English language lecturer and teacher in adult and higher education. She's enjoyed over 10 years of English language teaching, examining and training, and regularly speaks at international teacher training events. She has worked in several countries around the world, including China, Italy, and Spain. Deborah holds a DipTESOL and is currently studying from an MA ODE Open, Technology Enhanced Learning and Design. Prior to becoming an educator, Deborah was a business change and project manager in financial services. So, over to you, Deb.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time out from your busy schedules to join us today's webinar. It should take about 45 to 60 minutes, and I hope some of the issues and ideas raised will be of use to you in your teaching. Before we start, can I ask you to write a quick comment in the chat box, please, just so we can check everything is working correctly. Just your name, where you're joining us from, and maybe the time it is there. That would be great. You won't be able to see other attendees' comments, but I should be able to see them all. Okay, has anybody added any chat messages in? I think maybe you can only see the question panel, not the chat panel. So I'm just going to have a look at that. Okay, I can see some people here now. I've got Raj. Where are you from, Raj? Ah, yes, so Raj from Pakistan. I've got greetings from Sweden. Linda, welcome. Thank you. So let's get started. The session will be a little bit interactive in that there will be a couple of activities where I'll ask you to make comments. Additionally, there will be time at the end for questions and answers. The talk will start with a little background and some of the challenges I faced teaching exam classes, in my case for a certificate, followed by the challenges my students said they were facing. Then I'll briefly introduce my involvement with Cambridge and how we as teachers might help solve some of these challenges. I'll share some ideas and together we'll look at some materials and think about how they might be used to take learners beyond the exam and confidently into the real world. Okay, so as I said, I've been teaching exam English for a number of years. I've used some great course books in that time. Generally, I find that they take a targeted approach, so focusing almost exclusively on exam requirements in order to get students ready for their assessment. This is their purpose, of course. Nevertheless, there are challenges for us as exam teachers. These were some of my challenges. Sometimes, or fairly often in fact, students in my class were of slightly mixed ability. Not only that, but they learn, as we all do, I guess, at different speeds. And I felt that some of my students were almost ready for the next level. They wanted additional linguistic stimulation. Some students in the class weren't actually taking the exam. They were there because they thought they would learn more than they would in a general English class. You may have experienced that too, as I think it's fairly common amongst some learners. I also felt I wasn't teaching enough functional language they would need to communicate successfully in the real world. A colleague told me an anecdote once. She said her first certificate B1, B2 student who was doing really well in class and was anticipated to come away with a solid pass came in one day quite frustrated and demotivated. The student had taken a taxi over the weekend. She'd wanted to go to a local church, but although she was almost intermediate level, she didn't actually know how to order a taxi or tell the driver where she wanted to go. So she struggled to communicate effectively in the real world. As teachers, have you faced any of these challenges in your exam classes? How do you overcome them? Can you add a comment in the chat box, or if you can only reach the questions in the question box, please? Yes, I can see a few similar challenges there. Yes, Maria says that her students really couldn't perform so well outside the class as they could in the class. So when I'm thinking about the challenges that you have faced in your classroom, in your exam classroom, do you have students with mixed ability? Do you have students in your exam class that really want to be in a general English class, but they think they're going to learn more in exam class? Okay, so I decided to ask my exam students how prepared they felt for communicating in the real world, and this is what they said. I'll let you read them, but I'm wondering if your students have said anything similar to you. You can see that most students couldn't see the connection between the exam and the real world. They felt confident doing things in class, but less confident doing things outside the class. Having listened to my students, I decided to try and interpret what I thought they said to me. Of course, there were challenges with register, colloquial language, unexpected language, speed, etc. And I expected that. But I think we would see similar comments from general English students too. But what I really noticed was that students were having difficulties connecting the classroom learning to the real world, perhaps more so than general English students. They were confident in real world situations, but they weren't always aware of how the skills they were developing for the exam were actually transferable into the real world. Not only were students being hit with unexpected language outside of the classroom, let's call that linguistic curveballs, but I also had to ask myself, how far was confidence being affected by my students' perceived inability to transfer what they'd learned in the classroom into the real world, to make those important connections. And it got me thinking about the real world and life after the exam. Look at these photos. The middle one actually is me fixing my sink, actually. But how far do you feel your exam students are prepared for real world situations like, for example, these? How do you currently use your exam course materials to prepare them? How do you make the connections between the exam and the real world? Share your ideas, put some in the chat box if you like. Let's take a minute to do that. It can be tricky, can't it? Transferring the learning from the classroom into the real world. Oops. This is Neil. Neil is a commissioning editor at Cambridge University Press, and he stalked me on LinkedIn actually after I'd given a talk at IATEFL, and he asked me if I wanted to get involved in writing a course book. I told him I wasn't an author. He disagreed, and he said I was a teacher, and therefore I had created materials all the time. I had transferable skills, just like our students have. This was the framework that Neil approached me with. You can see that it largely reflected some of our challenges as exam English teachers. I thought it would give us a great opportunity to help students to make real-world connections in a less controlled environment and maybe bridge some of the gaps, particularly around functional language. I really wanted to help students identify transferable skills that they could take beyond the classroom. Okay, so we're trying to help students make the jump between the classroom, the exam, and the real world. We're trying to encourage them to make the links and connections and show them that they have the skills to achieve this, to achieve success in the real world. So I'm going to show you some materials. As you look at the materials, can you think about the two questions? I'm going to show you a material and pause for a few minutes while you think about and add a comment or two, and then we'll move to the next one. Obviously, you don't need to add any comments if you don't want to. Thinking is also good. So here's the first material. This is Bella. So the question is, how could you use this material in class? And what skills are transferable from the exam to the real world? I'm just going to give you a few minutes to have a look at that, think, and maybe put in a comment if you want to in the chat box. So the instructions are, how could you use this material in class? And what skills are transferable from the exam to the real world? Okay, so here is the material in its entirety. It's taken from a Speaking Part 3 training. And here's what we did with it. So you can see the exam skill Speaking Part 3, describing or introducing yourself, Speaking Part 3, and the real world skill, describing or introducing yourself. So there's a connection there between using the material for the exam and using the material for the real world. Let's look at the second material. This is a ticket. So again, how could you use this material in your exam class? And how could you transfer the skills from the exam to the real world? Finding key information, good, thank you, Linda. Sorry about that, Buzz. Extracting details such as numbers, yeah, that would be good. Reading the ticket, thank you, Mohammed, to get information. Ah, you wouldn't use it for speaking skills. Now, Giza, what would you use it for? Okay, here's what we did with it. It's actually taken from the real world section of the course book. The exam connection isn't so obvious with this one, but it's still there if we make the connection clear. So listening for detail and avoiding distractions, the real world skill, listening for announcement, functional language, tickets, etc. Yes, helping students know the directions for directions and instructions. Shafali, thank you. Interpreting information from boarding pass, yes, that's a good one. Right, let's move on now to the third material, material C, sentences. So the same idea, how would you use this material for the exam And how could you use the material for the real world? So how could you connect the learning for the student? I'll give you a few minutes to put your comments in. If you can use the question box to put your comments in rather than the chat box, that would be great. Just to remind you that you can't see each other's comments, but we can see them, okay? And also I had a question about transferable skills. What does that mean? Well, what a transferable skill is a skill that you might learn doing one thing that you can use to do something else. So me, for example, as a teacher, I created materials, but I didn't see myself as an author. However, I could transfer that skill. I could move that skill from materials writing to coursebook writing. Just keep, there we go. Okay, using familiar words or sentences that will help them to connect. Thank you, Mabuba. Gap filling in class, that's a nice one, Victoria. Paraphrasing the words in bold. Cesar says, that's really useful, yeah. Okay, let's have a little look now to see what we did with this material. So this comes from the Push Yourself section of the course book. And as you can see, it's about pushing language to the next level, supporting students who want that extra challenge. You can do this. It doesn't need to be in your course book. This is still something that you could do. Let's have a look at that in more detail. So we can see here the exam skill, upgrading language to the next level. Dealing with unexpected language is the real world skill, maybe dealing with more advanced phrases. Yes, Aisha says using figurative language in exams. Yes, that would be useful. Asking students what the phrases mean or if they get the meaning. Yes, thank you very much, Claudiana. Anna says to have a conversation and to keep a conversation. What do you mean by that, Anna? Ah, yes, drilling. Excellent. Okay, let's move on now to the next material. This is Jake and Christy. This one comes in two parts. So I think this one is Jake. A bit longer for you to read, so I'll give you a few extra minutes. What could you do with this material and how could you make the connections to the real world and to the exam? Just going to give you a few minutes to type your comments in the question box. How could you use this material in the exam? And how could you use this material in the real world and make connections between the two? Okay, I've got some comments now. Use synonyms or other words to say the same thing. Says Caesar, that's useful. Olivia, I can see your comments in the question box, so that's fine. You can continue to put comments in the question box and not the chat box, if you like. I think we have two different chat boxes, so question box is fine. Familiarising learners with common expressions, says Nagma, that's useful, yes. Asking students to identify figurative expressions, says Sabina. Cooking is part of life, I like that one. Maria says that she would ask students to interpret the situation. They love that. Yes, they really do, don't they? Let's look at the next one, the other part from this, because it's Jake and Christy. This is part one. And here we can see part two. This is Christy. So this is the same story, but two sides. So let's see now if that changes your view on what students can do with these two materials. The material could be used as a trigger for a discussion. Yes, that's a nice one, Cynthia. Problem-solving skills. Yes, good. Mainly for speaking, giving suggestions. Thank you, Chow. Functional language, yes. We've got lots of ideas here. Very nice, thank you. Role-playing, problem-solving, says Anna. Sharing personal experiences, that's a good one. Summarising a text, yes. Focus on replacing some words with new words. Thank you, Shivali. Kamal suggests that you could use material C and D, so Jake and Christy, to ask students to write about them. Yes, that would be good. Nagma suggests words to be used whilst cooking. Yes, lots of vocabulary in there. And role-playing. Excellent. Let's have a look to see how we used these materials. Okay, so they actually come from the grammar section of this particular unit. And here is the task from the course book. So we can see that Jake and Christy are friends. They've recently been having some problems. And so they have two opinions of the same story. And we actually used it to highlight regrets, which they could discuss. So the exam skill, part 4 sentence transformation, different ways of expressing regret, and the real life skill, dealing with difficult situations. I think you could definitely go on, as Helena suggests, and prepare a dialogue in pairs to act it out. Also, as Vidya suggests, self-expression and reflection, inviting students to find solutions, says Samia. Recognizing verb tenses and grammar structures. Yeah, that's great. So here they all are then, if we look at the table. And this is just some ways in which we can help students make connections between the exam tasks and the real world, and how we can help highlight to students that the skills that they're learning for the exam are transferable. And again, by transferable, we mean that we can take those exam skills and we can apply the skills in the real world. But we have to make those connections clear to our students. I don't think they realise that they always realise that they have the skills to communicate effectively in the real world. So here we can see Bella with the boxed words, speaking part 3, and then the real world skills, describing and introducing yourself. So that material has two purposes, not just for the exam, also for the real world. The ticket, listening for detail, avoiding distractions, could be our exam skill. Listening to an announcement, functional language, as many of you mentioned, could be the real world skill. Sentences, we've got there the upgrading language to the next level for that particular material. And the real world skill was dealing with unexpected language, using more advanced phrases. Jake and Christy, lots of ideas there, lots of really good ideas there. For the exam, part 4, sentence transformation, different ways of expressing regret. It's a really useful exam practice, but the connection there with the real world, dealing with difficult and awkward situations, real life situations. So a summary of the things that I've learned, I think, in my experience of teaching exam classes, but also my experiences of helping write the course book, was that we must consider life after the exam and how a skill can translate or be transferred to the real world. So how students can take a skill that they learn in class and use that skill effectively in the real world. And I think as educators and teachers, we need to do what we can to help our learners make those real world connections, which in turn can build their confidence. We need to highlight transferable skills, because students won't always work this out for themselves. They won't always realise that the skills they learn in class can be used outside the class. We need to take opportunities to upgrade language. And we always need to keep the real world in mind. So life beyond the exam and the relative safety of the classroom. It doesn't matter what course book or what materials you use, you can still make connections between the classroom and the real world, and you can still keep the real world in mind. Okay, and on the topic of upgrading language, I thought you might find this useful. This is a website, English Vocabulary Profile. I don't know if you know about this website. You do need to set up an account, but it is free. So I use it a lot when I'm writing or when I'm creating materials. You can search for language by grade, by topic, by function. And as we know, the Cambridge English exams are scored like this. So it's possible for a B2 student to come away with a C1 score. So it's always a good idea to add in some extra sort of push, some extra stretch for those students who feel that they're able to cope with that, or for those who feel that they need that as some sort of motivation. But I thought I would share that website with you because I found it particularly useful. The other thing to mention, I think, is about collaboration. I think it's really important, where possible, to ask our students to do activities and tasks together. I know we can't always do that, but collaboration generally does improve motivation and learning. And here are a couple of life competency tasks taken from the course book that actually does help with collaboration. So working in pairs. These are things that you can do in class at the end of a lesson, maybe help students to really understand the topic. Perhaps they can use their mobile phones to go online and do some research, but it's just an opportunity for students to work together and collaborate on a task when they might ordinarily just do the task on their own. Okay, so I think we've just about finished the things that we wanted to cover. So thank you everybody for your attention and for your comments. And back over to you, Jenny.
Hello again, everyone, and thank you so much, Deb, for such an interesting session. So to all of the attendees, I know some of you have already started asking about this, but you can download your certificate now. If you can see the tab marked handout, you can download the certificate now. It's a signed certificate and you can fill in your name and that will be your certificate for the event. If for any reason you can't download that now, we'll be sending out an email next week with the webinar recording and with this certificate attached. So either way, you'll be able to get this. Now, does anyone have any questions? I know this has been an interactive session, but if you have any other questions, general questions, anything that you've thought of as we've gone through, any questions for Deb at all, please type those in the question box and then Deb can answer these. I'll just give you a few minutes and then we'll see our questions. Okay, there's lots of thank yous, which is always nice.
And I apologise, initially I couldn't find your questions in the question box, so it took me a while to find you all, but I got there in the end. Any questions, anybody? Yes, the slide with the information about vocabulary, Jose, is that the English vocabulary? Yes, that is free. You do need to set up an account and then you get a password and you can just use it. I've used it quite a lot. You can search by topic, you can search by level. So if you're teaching B1, you can just select B1 and all of the vocabulary will come up. It's fairly comprehensive, really good for things like sports, hobbies, home life, that type of thing. So yes, it is free. I'm glad you found it useful, Tatiana.
Okay, I did spot one question earlier saying, do these techniques work for any of the Cambridge English exams?
I think they do, because I think the important thing is that we need to remain focused on what we're actually doing as teachers and as educators. And although we're preparing students for the exam, what we're really doing is preparing them for life after the exam. We're preparing them to communicate effectively in the real world. So I think we can always make those connections between whatever exam you're teaching, Cambridge or otherwise, and the real world. And I think it's important that we do that. I think as educators and teachers, we have a responsibility to do that. Any other questions?
Okay,
I can't see
I'm seeing a couple of questions
here.
here.
Good.
Deb. How can we decide the advanced idioms? How could we find idioms for advanced? I suppose some of those might be on English Profile.
They are.
Under the advanced tab.
Yeah, there are some on English Profile in the advanced tab. I think the important thing to remember is that we need to think about the idioms that students will come into contact with when they are outside of the classroom. So they need to be ones that students will use and need to know. So I think we need to be quite selective, but certainly there are some in the English Profile, absolutely. English Vocabulary Profile, yes. You might need to read any more questions out to me, Jenny, because I can't see the bottom of the question box, unfortunately.
Okay. Are there any special free sites that provide quality material on how to get prepared for exams? Well, I can answer that one. There is obviously cambridgeenglish.org, and I'll put that link in reply to your question as well. English.org. It depends on the exam level. For example, at the moment, the key and preliminary exams are being updated. We have another website to prepare for these with lots of free resources there. And I'll add that next to your question in the chat as well. Okay, so you should be able to see that in a second. A couple of links to some free websites. And then lots more thank yous. That's great.
I can't move my mouse because every time I do, I lose the screen. So I'm trying to look at the questions without moving the mouse. Any more, Jenny?
Another question here, Deb. How can one utilise the skills to get the students and real world to connect when pupils are confronting the barriers in the schooling system they're enrolled in? That's from Deepak.
That can be quite challenging, can't it, Deepak? I think because schools often have a specific target and goal, and it is typically passing the exam. And I think some materials are very exam focused, which is excellent. I think for me, I would probably take opportunities when I could to provide that real world connection. I think it may not always be obvious in the course book or in the materials that you're using. So you may need to add so that you can make the connection. It needn't take very long. I appreciate you're really busy. It needn't take very long to do that. It could just be, it might even just be telling us the students, letting the students know that what the connection is between the exam and the real world. So for example, here we've done grammar, word transformation. However, you could also use this language if you were in a difficult conversation with somebody like Jake and Christy were. So I think we need to make those connections clear when we can. I hope that's answered your question. Any more, Jenny?
How to deal with mixed ability learners in a class, especially when the language being taught is a second language and there are not really real world connections. Lots of real world connections. I have to say, Deb is co-author of Open World, which is our new course, which is released this year with levels for key, preliminary and first. And it does have a very specific real world link, bridging the gap between exam and classroom English and real world situations. So I've typed the link a few times in answers in the chat. I'll pop it in again now, but you can find more information about this exam and real world course at cambridge.org/openworld. But I will pop that again in the answer in the chat. Is there anything else you wanted to add about that, Deb?
It's quite interesting.
Comment.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, the mixed ability, because I've experienced that a lot. Sometimes students get a little bit shoehorned into classes because of numbers and things. I think an awareness of the different levels is useful, but also an awareness that some students will pick things up quicker than others and come prepared with language that's perhaps a slightly higher level for those students that need it. It can be a bit more time consuming, I think, if you've got different levels in class, but it's thinking about how you can use one material to do a number of different things. So that material perhaps can be used for different levels. So maybe picking out numbers if it's a lower level on tickets, whereas for higher levels you might do something slightly different with the material, if that makes sense. So we've got a few minutes left, I think, haven't we, Jenny? If there's any more questions or any other ideas that you want to share.
Okay, another question from Deepak. There's a world outside the classroom. How can one get his students to believe this when he's trying to get the connection between students in the real world? In addition, where they're bound and limited for a period that now they believe exam is the only life. It's more about how do you inspire them to believe that there's a real use of English beyond the classroom, what we're looking at.
That's a very, very big question, isn't it? What would I do? That's a huge question. I know. I shall use an exam phrase and say that's a very interesting question. Let me take a moment to think about it. Well, I mean, the taxi driver example that my colleague gave, I think was really useful. The student that was performing well in class when she wanted to catch a taxi over the weekend, she didn't know how to ask the taxi driver to take her somewhere. And I just think that it depends on what the student's motivation, I guess. A student may need the exam for a specific reason. They may not actually need then to communicate with local people. They may not need to communicate in a real world environment. They may need it for their CV. So I think we do need to understand what motivates the students. But for students who do need to communicate outside the classroom, then I think we have to try and encourage them to see the connections between the exam and the real world, wherever possible.
Okay. So I can't see any more questions, but I'm getting some thanks. So I'll just read out. Thank you so much for making it so easy to show my students how useful it might be for them, what they're learning in class.
Thank you.
That's from Kuo Min. I hope I said that correctly. Probably not. And thank you. It was a very informative webinar. I'm still studying at the university, but soon I may start working as a teacher. I share the same feeling with Bella, another teacher. Oh no, that was from your speaking activity. Fearing the lack of experience. I'll do my best taking your advice into account and keeping the real world always in mind.
Thank you.
So that was Haitia. Again, I probably pronounced that incorrectly, but thank you for all your positive feedback. We're really happy that that you found it useful. Just checking there's no more questions before we finish.
Claudiana wants to know how she can attend more webinars.
Where can we find out about more webinars? Is that the question?
How can I attend more webinars is the question.
Okay, so on the cambridge.org site, if you go to the section marked events, that's where we list all of our webinars. So if you keep an eye on that, or also follow Cambridge ELT on social media, Facebook and Twitter, you'll also see updates about upcoming webinars and be able to register for those. Okay, we've had a few questions about certificates. We will send out the certificates by email if you've not been able to download from the handouts today, so don't worry about that. And all being well, you'll also receive the webinar recording. So thank you all for attending and for being so interactive. It's been great to have you here.
I apologise for anyone's questions that weren't answered. So obviously we haven't been able to answer all questions. So please accept our apology if you asked a question and we didn't have a chance to answer it.
Yeah, but that's all we've got time for today. Thank you for attending. So don't forget cambridge.org/ELT events for future webinars, and keep an eye out on our blog and YouTube channel for the recording of this webinar next week, but we'll also be emailing you. Okay, thank you all, and we hope
to
see you again sometime in the future. And thank you, Deb, that's been really interesting.
Thank you.